Welcome back, folks, to the Tonic Accord podcast. We are talking about politics, as always, and especially today, we're talking about Biden's recently unveiled plan to look into the policy proposals around expanding the Supreme Courts. This is something that came up in the during the election season. He was asked a lot about what his plans to do with the Supreme Courts are, and this is one of his campaign promises to kind of look into expanding it. So today we're going to be discussing the debate between expanding the courts, not expanding the courts, looking at the history around the Supreme Court, and as well what Biden's plan is to look at this issue and if it's viable. So today I'm joined, as always, by my friend and co-host Alex Capicco. How you doing, man?
Doing okay, staying sane. With all the craziness between the police violence and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I'm kind of happy we're not talking about either one today, to be completely honest. So, yeah, but I'm doing pretty well, my friend. Hope you are as well. This is kind of an interesting topic to me because it's like, obviously the Constitution doesn't actually define how many, for example, in the Supreme Court. It never said there had to be 9 Supreme Court justices. Right. But over time, that's kind of been the accepted number. And since the Civil War, that's kind of been just the standard, 9 justices. I can understand why the Democrats are thinking about it. They have a majority. They've won the popular vote in most of the last, 4 to 5 elections, yet they sometimes lose the elections. And basically they have a majority that appeals to the country, but then the Republicans, who have a minority a lot of the time, are able to keep picking justices that represent the entire country. So in theory, I understand why this is happening. But I think the big question to me, and it's probably the question that a lot of more moderates are asking, is kind of what is the intent of expanding the courts here? Is it for political goals or just to kind of improve the court system? And I think that's kind of what I'm not totally sure about, but I think that's kind of the issue.
Yeah, that is certainly the issue, right? We saw the question of Supreme Courts and appointments bubble up as a political issue, multiple times in Trump's presidency, right? He was able to, and again, for those that don't know, presidents are the ones that appoint or nominate appointees for the vacant seats in the Supreme Court, of which there are only 9. And so throughout his term, Trump was able to get 3 appointments, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. So a third of the court is Trump's. And so you saw, and that was one of his campaign promises, right? Trump mentioned that, one of the things he'll do is put conservatives on the court. That's why a lot of people liked him. That was one of his big, that was even part of his re-election process, was that like all that Ruth Bader Ginsburg stuff happening right around November. One of the big things was, well, if not now, then in the next term, can Trump, keep a conservative court and appoint another conservative judge? So the nature, the idea that, we have to remember that the issue around the Supreme Court and who gets to appoint who has been political for a while. I'm saying it's a good thing, but if we're going to talk about, is Biden making this court issue a political issue? I would say that it's already been a political issue for a while. And if you can look at the rhetoric used around the Supreme Court on both sides, especially the Kavanaugh hearing, right, highly contentious, very split among party lines. It's been morphed into a political apparatus for a while, even though it's not supposed to be. This conversation is ongoing, and I do think it's worth wondering, why can we expand the court? It has been hundreds of years, yes, but it has happened before. I think the court started at 7. There's a little bit of history here I'm getting from a Harvard little piece that, it started at 6 members at the beginning, and then it shrank to 5 for a little bit, and then it went back up to 7th, and then 9th. It's been suggested to go above that. Famously, FDR wanted to stack the courts up to 16 judges, and that was shot down during the New Deal era. But there is movement and precedent for changing the number of Supreme Court justices. So just to get that out of the way, it's not like it's absolutely set in stone, because it's not.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a good point on FDR as well, because from the little bit of things I read on that, it sounds like he wanted to pack the courts as purely a power grab, And, that is very fitting for FDR. He was probably the closest this country has had to, I don't want to say dictator, but he was definitely a very strong federal president. And it sounded like actually what happened is even his own vice president and even his own allies in Congress basically were like, man, we're not doing this. He wanted to like cap off justices at 70 and just replace these justices while they were still working. And so it sounded like chaos. It sounded like he had a bitter issue with the Supreme Court over a chicken poultry company issue. And it sounded like it was purely political and purely about power. And I don't think that's the reason why Biden and the Democrats want to do it in this case. And I'm actually not for packing the courts. I'm just going to put that out now. I don't actually support this. But I do think that the public opinion on it is changing because Biden, for a long time has talked about how he wouldn't do it. A lot of centrist Democrats have been against it. And, 4 or 5 years ago, it was mainly progressives that wanted it. Bernie Sanders has been more supportive of it. But other than that, there's not a lot of huge political figures that were actually for it. But, Pete Buttigieg mentioned it. Kamala Harris mentioned it. Elizabeth Warren mentioned it during the presidential debates. And it seems like even Chris Coons of Delaware has become for it after he was against it his whole career. So there is a change on the left that even moderate Democrats are like, hey, the Republicans keep playing politics and maybe it's time that we actually fight back. And so public opinion is changing. And it does go back to it is that, Trump has never won a majority in any of these elections, and yet he was able to appoint 3 justices. And I don't think that's what the founding fathers hoped for in the Supreme Court, is that a minority can dictate public policy like that.
I think you make an interesting point about, playing political, which is, and I think it brings the Democratic Party and the Biden administration at a serious crossroads, and which is kind of why they're doing this, this committee or whatever to look into the options in the first place, is because, like you said, is ideally, this branch of government is supposed to be apolitical, right? Not a political institution, about interpreting constitutional law with, experts, basically. These judges are legal experts and have been judges for a long time, right? Blah, blah, blah. The reality is not that, though. The reality is, like we've mentioned, is that, it's a point of presidents to say, hey, if I'm able to, I will appoint a conservative or a liberal judge to balance the court in my political favor. I mean, that is exactly what Donald Trump did. And that's not out of the norm. That's now, I think, a conversation that, if there is a seat to be up soon, if kind of that's the vibe people are getting, whether it's Anton Scalia or Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, Scalia was 79 when he, gave up his seat, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in her 80s when she passed and was no longer a judge, right? So, but if you have a seat kind of almost about to be available, there's always a conversation about, which president's going to be able to replace it? Is it going to be liberal or is it going to be conservative? Almost immediately the conversation is political. And if we look at the history in the last few years of how the Republicans in Congress and in the executive branch have acted around the courts, it has been political. Let's look at, like, when Obama was about to leave office, his nominee was blocked because it was the end of a term, an election was coming up, and we famously had Lindsey Graham say, "Mark my words, when the shoe's on the other foot, you can quote me saying," right? And famously, the shoe was on the other foot with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and yet the Republicans slammed that nomination through. Had we seen a similar reaction, Obama's nominee would have been blocked and Trump's nominee would have been blocked, or vice versa. Obama's nominee would have been allowed and Trump's nominee would have been allowed. But obviously there's a political difference, and that is why you had one nominee not get pushed through and another allowed to get pushed through so close to the election. Is because of a political difference, not any sort of constitutional interpretation difference. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, like you said, Republicans have been playing political with the courts. So the Democrats then have to ask themselves, do we do the same? Do we fight back? Do we just play political as well? And it's, or continue to at least, or do we try and take the high road? And I think this is kind of an overarching battle within the Democratic Party in general because of the, other issues of like election fraud claims and stuff. It does seem like Republicans are playing really dirty. And from my point of view, they have for a while with the electioneering and, clearing voter logs in Florida in 2000 and stuff. But so do you then say, do we fight back the same way? Do we fight fire with fire, so to speak? Or do we try and take the high road? And it does seem like that's a tough thing to say, because if let's say oh, we'll take the high road. Okay, then you're going to continue to have a conservatively packed court, even though you're winning elections or getting close. You're not ever going to have your say on the court. Or do we just play dirty and expand the courts and be like, yeah, man, you know what? You got 3 nominees and you didn't even win the majority vote. Maybe we should just have a more left-leaning Supreme Court, because that reflects the public opinion better. It's a tough one. But I kind of lean towards, I think I would have leaned towards staying in the middle and respecting, the 9 judges setup a few years ago. But I think after Trump, after this whole election BS, after seeing how far the Republican Party is willing to go outside of ideology and ethics and morals just to win, then I say, yeah, man, screw them. Expand the courts and to extend and have an olive branch, maybe extend it over time. You add 1 justice now, add another justice in 4 years, and add a 3rd justice in another 4 years after that.
That's a very astute point. And, I can't help but agree with it, is that I think prior to the Trump era, when maybe we had, the neocons or the Republicans that we remember for most of our lives, I would say that I think that there is still a possibility to depoliticize the courts. But as you said, it does seem that I would probably say since the beginning of the Tea Party, the Republican Party, and I know I hit this across the head every week, but they've become obstructionist, conspiratorial, and unwilling to work with the other side. And so, I do think it's just such a toxic environment on the right in terms of kind of what they'll do for power, that it does make it difficult. Now, my fear of it, though, is that I can understand why there are critics of it, and I actually
sure.
I agree with Joe Manchin more than probably some of our listeners would like to hear. But I understand that he's worried about a zigzagging court. And, there's this unspoken rule in democracy, and obviously it's already been thrown out the door, but to me it still holds true, is that the majority must remember that one day they will be in the minority.
Right.
And, for this reason, you don't want to completely skew a system that works for you momentarily. And Bloomberg has a good kind of article on this, where they discuss how democracy is, this equilibrium between opposing parties. And if you break this equilibrium, kind of like I said, you're going to pay the price. And they basically say that what Mitch McConnell did with Merrick Garland in 2016, I think it was horrible, and Democrats should be more combative and actually more willing to fight for these things. But the Bloomberg article's point is that packing the courts would be dramatically more extreme in the long term, potentially, than just one pick. And now I would probably take issue with that, because obviously Kavanaugh is going to be there for a long time. So that is a systematic issue. But they worry that basically what's going to happen is the legitimacy of the court over time is going to just completely fall, because you're just going to zigzag from ideological extreme to ideological extreme. But then again, this is not quite the same as other things like the filibuster, because these people are in there for a long time. And I think there's alternatives then. So that kind of puts me into, I think there are alternatives to packing the courts that actually might make more sense. Probably the most easy one that you and I've talked about before is term limits.
Right.
That actually could take congressional legislation, not an amendment, because an amendment would be super tough. But from what I've gathered, there are legal scholars who think it could be done through Congress and not an amendment, which could be interesting. There's also jurisdictional stripping, which is basically the theory that Congress could pass laws like the Affordable Care Act or the Green New Deal without the Supreme Court, which I don't know how I feel about. But the one I actually liked, and it's kind of complicated, but is the balanced bench. Yeah. Where the court would start with 10 justices, right? And 5 are chosen by Democrats and 5 are chosen by Republicans, all with lifetime appointments. And then those 10 justices would select an additional 5 from the federal appeals courts, who would join the Supreme Court for 1-year terms. So it could kind of create a balance while also allowing both sides to have some ideological representation. I just think that packing the courts, because it's just, to me, it's a very political side of it, I think they need to do more research on something like a balanced bench.
I think that's a good point. So yeah, you made it. Yeah, and I have some issues with the balanced bench, which I'll get into in a sec. But it's an interesting take, and you certainly are right that I think it's more damaging. Like if your complaint is like, well, they're just gonna put in the youngest people they can to be as conservative as possible for the longest amount of time. So then our idea is to then put in someone also super young by judges' standards, and have them be super liberal for a long period of time, right? That fighting with fire idea, you know, like you said, is long-term issues, maybe short-term game, long-term problems. I am 100% for the term limits, and I think, you know, I saw one scholar mention 18 years, right? 18 years would be enough to have a long kind of standing career, enough time to have a legacy, as also as understand the Supreme Court and its intricacies over that time, but then still get people out of there before they are in their 70s and 80s, right? So certainly on board with that. The problem with the balanced bench is, though, that you're basically accepting defeat for the politicization of that branch, right? If you're saying that, okay, well, let's let Democrats pick 5, let's let Republicans pick 5, you're basically sealing the deal even further than it already is, that those are the two parties that exist in American government, and those are the only two parties, and that's how we're dealing with our government imbalance. I do think that, you know, as much as we've had Republicans and Democrats in its current form for about 100 years, 100 years isn't that long. And before then, you had Whigs, and you've had all sorts of morphing and changing of political stances and parties. That I don't want to rule out the idea that the Republican Party could split into two, or the Democratic Party could dissolve. You know, who knows what time will tell. But I do think that the balanced bench, while it's a great idea, it is a good idea. It does kind of lead to the issue of, are we really just kind of defeatist in the sense that we're just going to accept how politicized that branch is? And then there's also the issue of, let's say one of the Republican seats, you know, passes away, and then you have a Democratic president. Is it still the president who gets to appoint a nominee? Like, that process might have to be adjusted as well, which could happen. But as I love the idea of the balanced bench, I just don't think it's practical in terms. It's in practical terms, you'd have to finagle a lot of weird scenarios, like people dying with a different president from the other party. Like, does the party then get determined in nomination, or is it still the president? But it gets more into the ballpark. I also heard some other options was a pool of justices. So instead of having 9 justices and boom, that's it, that's your seat until you literally kick the bucket, you would have a pool of maybe all the top federal appellate court of appeals judges, right? 100 or so, or you know, pick a pool, right? But basically get a pool of maybe 20 to 100 of the top judges in the area, and have them be on the Supreme Court to take different cases. But each case you're getting a different set of from the pool of judges. You're not getting the same judges for every single case, and it'd be a lot harder to predict the sway of the court on a case before it is seen, right? Also, increasing the pool of judges would probably increase the amount of cases that could be seen in the Supreme Court, which is notoriously low, right? I mean, they get presented hundreds of thousands, and they only see, you know, 12 or 20 a year. So I do think it's worth rehashing how we do the Supreme Court, and you said, there's alternatives to just stacking it, and I think that is what Biden is trying to do. I think Biden is, again, he's not even saying he's going to stack the court, and in fact, all he's ordering is a commission to look into the debate around it, and and even that commission is not even supposed to give a policy proposal, just to present the ideas. What do you think of that?
Well, first, I just want to address one thing you were saying there, because I think you bring up a good point with the balanced bench, and also talking about that kind of pool lottery system type of thing, is that actually, yeah, with that pool system, you know, because I think the talking point that actually I use, and I hear a lot of conservatives use, and I've heard people on the left use, is that a lot of these justices, they may be an R or a D next to their name, but a lot of them do act independently in specific cases. And maybe if you did have this kind of alternating pool of who's making a decision on a different issue, maybe Trump, for example, wouldn't nominate someone like Kavanaugh or Gorsuch just because they have one view that he knows is going to be respected to conservatives. So I would agree with you on that. And also, like, I think the issue too is why term limits for me is the most important one, is because the founding fathers, let's be honest, I don't think they thought people were going to live that long. Yeah. So when you're having a judge, you know, that's now in their 80s, like Breyer is, I think he's 82, you get to a weird point where they're like so concerned about power and legacy that sometimes it's to the detriment of the future. Like that was the issue with RBG, excuse me, was that in 2013, I was reading that Obama, his administration approached her to try to talk about her, stepping down so they could appoint someone.
Yeah.
And she was such a cultural icon that it didn't happen. And now Breyer, there's new talks this week about a very similar situation. Is they're basically saying, hey man, you're like a progressive fighter. You've done a lot of great things, but you're 82. And it doesn't sound like he wants to step down either, and so and that brings a problem is that by the time, like you said, a lot of these cases never even get brought to the Supreme Court. That's also the issue, is because like the Supreme Court is kind of behind where the country's going.
Yeah.
And so like all these things put together, like I think the most simple one would be term limits. But going on to your Biden thing, I actually have issue with the fact that it's just a commission. And the reason why is that I think there was the article you shared in the Nation had some really good points on that, where it was basically like, I think there was a quote, I'm going to butcher it, but it was like, Democrats want to do the book report before they recommend any policies, but Republicans just get in there day one and wreck shit up, excuse my language. But, and that's my issue about this, is it kind of seems like Biden's kind of kowtowing to both sides here, because like there's some Federalist Society people in this commission. There's also like a lot of center Democrats, but that Nation article was talking about how there's not a single progressive who is actually fighting for this issue. So to me, it sounds like, yeah, Biden, like to me, I liked it at first because I'm like, at least he's curious and he's willing to learn and see what could work. But the more I look into it, it's like 180-day commission into maybe just if this could work. That's the midterms. The Republicans could already have seats again.
Yeah.
Like it to me, it seems like Biden's being too pragmatic when I don't think either side wants pragmatism. The right clearly doesn't, and the left clearly doesn't. Like, so I don't understand who he's trying to appease here, because it's not appeasing progressives, it's not appeasing Trumpists, it's really not appeasing me. So I think at a normal time this would make sense, but it's like, dude, you have potentially a year and a half to get some stuff done, and this just doesn't seem to be doing it.
It is strange that it's a commission that like can't put forth a policy proposal, just study the issue, but there's been studies on the issue. I'm sure there's like, I don't know, like it's just strange that it's like we want to look into the issue, but without suggesting which way we're going to go with it, or even suggesting any way at all. It's like, yeah, dude, isn't there already like whole classes about this? Like, can you talk to, like, it's made up of a ton of professors. If you can browse who's a part of this committee on the WhiteHouse.gov site about it. And it's like all these like, obviously super like well-known and established professors. And it's like, can't we just find like I don't know. It's just 180 days to basically sift through literature that's already been written. It does seem strange. And that was a pretty scathing criticism from the Nation, which you read the first paragraph and you almost think he's like some like super far right, because he's like, Democrats keep losing and Biden's dumb. And then he goes into why, because he's not doing enough, because there's literally a precedent. There already is precedent, which we talked a little bit about.
Right.
Then he should just go for it. However, I do understand that when you talk about, like, I mean, I remember in the debates, the conversation around the Supreme Courts would come up, and Biden would get really hush-hush and kind of worried and fidgety. I mean, it is a really big, controversial issue, and I imagine, let's say you said Biden did say we're actually looking at options to expand the courts, like we've taken a stance and we want to do it. The pushback from the Republicans is going to be immense. I mean, they're literally going to call him a dictator. The thing is aren't they doing that already? I mean, anything he does, he gets a ton of flack from Republicans. So it's this balance of how big of an issue will this be with the public? Will this turn people off? Like, will this really turn moderates off? Or is this something that they can kind of get away with? I don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure what the commission's purpose is. I'd be more interested into studying the public opinion around something like this, let alone less so the congressional logistics of it, because it feels like the congressional logistics are there. I mean, we just went over 4 or 5 different ways to reform the courts. Obviously, a big roadblock to any kind of movement would still be the filibuster, and Joe Manchin and his in his ivory throne that he's found himself in just by happenstance of being a moderate Democrat at a very gridlocked Congress. I've literally split Senate. someone like Joe Manchin blocking the filibuster could ruin any chance of reforming the court, even in the slightest. So that's still a problem. But yeah, it's this weird committee. I think for Biden, I think it's a check. I think it's checking off a campaign promise. Look, the guy is up to a lot of bold stuff outside of this, right? He's being very bold with the vaccine rollout. He's being very bold with his, COVID biggest trillion package plan in history. He's also being pretty bold with his new infrastructure plans and his talk around that. So he's being pretty bold for whether you like it or not. It does seem like this is more where he's being a little shy, a little meek, and I understand why. But it does seem like this committee is kind of a waste of time. I would like to see a continuation of his bold moves and just go for what you said. Hey, let's like put term limits on this thing. I think that's something that you can even get Republicans around. I mean,
oh yeah,
my conservative family members talk about term limits all the time in regards to Congress members and the court. I think that's probably one where you can rally a lot of people around it, and then you can point out the hypocrites when they talk about it. Whoa, term limits, I don't know about that. Like, dude, well, what the hell, man? It's not political. I don't know. I think term limits where you and we agree on the most, but it's going to be really tough to do anything else.
Yeah. And real quickly, I'll just add that, I think you're onto something. And I know the U.S. is historically we're kind of a laissez-faire, kind of fearful of big government country. But time and time again, we do seem to see that some of the most popular presidents in U.S. history were the transformative ones. Mm-hmm. As much as people don't like an authoritarian, I think they do, as long as they're somewhat of a benevolent authoritarian, if that's a thing. FDR, the right does not like him, and I have some issues with the scope of power he did. But him, Lyndon Johnson, just to name two, were quite Unitarian. Let's just bring the hammer down and get what we want done. And Biden actually seems to be kind of following that same thing. Biden to me seems kind of like a Lyndon B. Johnson, and I think that there's a lot he could do with this. But the issue is that Jim Jordan, Marco Rubio, and several other conservatives are now pushing for an amendment procedure to basically say the Constitution, now we're going to amend it so there's only 9 judges ever allowed on the Supreme Court. And so, again, I think Biden actually, like you said, he's been bold on so many different things that I think this is something that importantly needs to be done, or at least there needs to be a conversation that's had, because these Republicans, especially the kind of populist Jim Jordan types, they want to make sure that this minority coalition that Trump built is going to stay for a long time. Yeah. And that worries me as well, because it's 6-3, I think, right? With conservatives right now. And
yeah,
that's not particularly good if you're a minority or a woman, to be completely honest with, because I think over time, the Supreme Court is kind of slow and follows the cultural trends. But now what if the trend is already quite anti-LGBT and abortion on the right? In 5 years, we could see some overturning of Roe v. Wade and other things. I truly think we could.
Yeah, it's it is interesting because like the Jim Jordan thing. That's a great example of, I think it's so obviously politicized. He's not a judge though. He's in Congress, right? So that's kind of his gig. That's his job. But that's so obvious because it's like let's solidify that it's 9 forever, always in stone. It's like why? It was never been that way. I mean, we've had a 9 for a while, but what other purpose than to just say F you Biden? We have our judges for a while. What other purpose does that legislation serve? Now, to extend another olive branch to maybe people that are supportive of what Trump did with the court is we have seen that 6-3 is not always 6-3 on every issue, right? We've had some issues not go Trump's way, even after stacking Barrett, right? I think on some immigration law and some more cultural wedge issues, the court has gone against Trump's wing. And so it doesn't always equate to one-on-one. However, it is worth mentioning, though, that Trump was bold. Trump was bold in his Supreme Court, and the Republicans in Congress were bold to push forth their nomination, right? So why can't Biden be bold? The same thing. Why can't we reform our Supreme Court system? Nothing is perfect, and I think it would be ridiculous. It'd be ridiculous to say, well, that's the way we've done it for 100 years, so it must be the best way to do it. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And I think there is a way to reform our court without doing the let's just stack it FDR style and piss everyone off way. So maybe that is what Biden's looking into. I don't know, man, but it does seem strange with this little committee. It seems like he's testing the waters, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the last thing I'll say is that, I think the big disconnect between the right and the left here is that the Republicans have faith in the system and they have faith in the Constitution in a very originalist view of it. And Democrats actually seem to be changing to believe that systematic reform is necessary. And I don't know how you really bring those two ideas together, is because it seems like Republicans want to work in the system that was created by our founding fathers. And it clearly seems like Democrats don't think that's good enough. And that could be a whole other discussion. But yeah. I think that's the issue that's going to be hard to reconcile.
Absolutely, and it is at the horcrux of this topic. So that'll do it for this topic today. You can even look more into what Alex just mentioned. We do have an episode about amending the Constitution, so definitely look into that one if you're more interested in that kind of topic. So yeah, let us know what you think. Should the courts be expanded, or is this just a political retribution for what Trump did, appointing 3 nominees constitutionally during his time? What are your opinions on Congress and their actions around the court? Is it too politicized, or should we just admit that it's so politicized? Let us know your thoughts on the Supreme Court. It's obviously something that will be, an ongoing topic, and as they continue to determine huge constitutional changes in the United States. So as always, we're the Tonic Accord. If you're watching live, stay tuned. We're going to have a special guest on talking about NGOs in Brazil specifically. Check us out on Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and whatever, look for us on whatever podcast site you use. Thanks for listening.